Welcome to Soul Care, a message that will hopefully touch on some of the things in your life that really matter. That's my hope. You may have heard of Brené Brown. Many people have heard of her. In fact, over 60 million people listened to her first TED Talk that was in 2010 on the topic of vulnerability, which made her famous. Brené Brown has a way of being very down to earth in the way she talks, very real, and yes, very vulnerable herself. She has the credentials to talk about human relationships. She's a social worker by training with a master's in social work and also PhD in the same field. She started her research about the time of 9/11, and the research went into the subjects of uncertainty and ambiguity and how people are affected in crisis by those feelings. Millions listen now to her podcast called Unlocking Us. Why? Well, I guess we need to hear that it's okay to be yourself, to unlock yourself and be real. She says we are more resilient than we know, and there will be far more trauma than we anticipate. Brené Brown has good suggestions for this pandemic time that we are in. Certainly her research and her wisdom applies to today. These are 4 points. First, she says to understand the full toll that anxiety takes. Anxiety makes us spiritually, physically, and mentally weary, she says. The only way I can think about it is we have to grieve the loss of normal. At the exact same time, we're trying to find our footing in a new normal. We've been doing that now for over a year. Her second point is move your body because we store trauma and grief and anxiety in our bodies. And the third is don't rank your suffering. That whole mythology of rank ordering suffering is built on the idea that compassion and empathy are finite. That's not the way they work. Even every time we practice empathy and compassion, we make more empathy and compassion. And the last point is it's okay to be vulnerable right now. The definition of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She says, give me a single example of courage in your life or that you've witnessed in someone else's life. One example of courage that did not require uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. That's all part of the game. Resilience is something I've talked about before, and many of these same points keep coming up during this pandemic time. We actually gain courage when we deal with life problems and survive them. When I think back, perhaps my first experience with trauma was having a much-loved uncle die. I can remember the moment that I learned of his death. We were traveling across country to be with him and other relatives in New England, and we stopped in Ohio to see one of my aunts, and we were going up the stairs into her house to put our things away in the bedrooms that she'd prepared for us. And on the landing of the staircase going up, my mother asked my aunt about our uncle who had not been well. And she turned and tears came into her eyes and she said, "He died today." She'd been waiting to tell us that, but first she wanted to welcome us into her home. So we stood there on the landing of the stairs in that dark staircase, and the 3 of us cried. I, a child, my mother, and my aunt. I guess I learned that when you've lost someone dear to you, you cry. Another year, another uncle called to our house to tell us that his baby son, my cousin Peter, had been run over by a truck. Oh, it makes me sad to still think about it. I remember hearing my dad on the telephone. I was walking up the stairs from my bedroom to the main part of the house. Again, I was on a staircase, and I remember his voice from the front hall speaking to his brother about the terrible loss, the death of baby Peter. Well, that uncle whose baby Peter died came to visit us another year, a few years later, and while he was with us, President Kennedy was shot. I remember where I was when I heard that, and I know many of you know too where you were. I was in my social studies class. I can just see myself sitting there, and a counselor came into each room and she announced that President Kennedy had been shot and there would be an assembly and then school would be dismissed. We were silent. And then in complete silence, we walked to the auditorium and listened to the news, and then were dismissed to go home. These are moments of vulnerability as individuals and then as a country. They touch us in a deep place. It's so real, and it is universal that as human beings we react to such loss. We're seeing this now as we watch television and see in India people clinging to their loved ones who have passed away from COVID-19, frustrated that they had not gotten the care they needed. Being real now during this pandemic year of the coronavirus includes admitting those feelings that are inside us. Some of us are just tired of it all. It's pandemic fatigue. It makes us cranky, especially if we're living with someone. We notice how cranky we are, and it makes us lonely if we live alone. It helps, I think, to take a walk. Maybe with a friend, take a walk, somehow just chat with someone and say the same things that your friend says about how, we're kind of in a funk right now. It's not a happy time. It somehow makes you feel okay if someone else is feeling the same way. If we don't work out these negative feelings by expressing them, they tend to get worse. Fear can settle in, and we can retreat altogether into ourselves. Or we can lash out. That seems to be the other response. For anyone feeling destabilized by fear, Brené Brown cautions against lashing out. She says we tend to be our worst selves when we are afraid. She goes on to say, so we have to be intentional about choosing kindness and generosity. That's her advice. So in this vulnerable time, it's probably a good idea first to express our negative feelings, hopefully without blaming. Just like we can choose to voice our concerns, we can also choose to speak with kindness and generosity. It's such a basic idea. Why do we even need to say it? Kindness and generosity? Well, of course. Well, I guess I admit that I need a reminder sometimes. When I'm feeling cranky, I need to give myself a little pep talk or to hear someone say that kindness and generosity are very important. I'm sure it's not fun to live with me when I'm grumpy. So really, I need to take care of my own feelings and then monitor how I treat others. Treat others as you wish to be treated. That's the golden rule. It's the basic rule of every world religion. From as early as the days of Confucius on, it's been written down. Our Bible has the golden rule in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So where does God come into this anyway? Many of us believe that God knows us inside and knows how we can best live together as a society. God has sent us prophets, we believe, to tell us when we fail how we need to make corrections and live differently. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God, it says in the prophet Micah's words. And God then sent Jesus to teach us what is most important of all the commandments. One of the scribes asked Jesus, which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Basic truths. That's what they are, basic truths. And the psalmist says in Psalm 139, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. It's all there. I think it's okay to be real. God knows who we are anyway. It's healthy to be able to express our sadness and our fears, to get them out, to hear them said aloud. And we know we are not only made up of sadness and fear. We are also kind and generous by nature. And we truly want to foster healthy relationships. So be yourself. Be your kind and generous and real self. And then it will be well with your soul.